Brian Hanley is a name you probably will not know, but might ought to. He's a geneticist working primarily on HIV therapies, but he's become the subject of a great deal of discussion for something pretty different. 5 years ago, he injected himself with an agent that spurred the production of a specific hormone in his body called GHRH. He then electrocuted himself. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but early results seem to suggest that this relatively simple procedure may have turned back his biological clock by 6 years. He may have made himself younger. Well, have Hanley's experiments been successful, and what does it mean for the rest of us? I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Arya Babu, a researcher at the think tank The Entrepreneurs Network. Welcome to the programme. Have we cracked ageing? Is this something that is really incredibly significant?
Yes, if this is the solution to ageing, then this is probably one of the biggest scientific breakthroughs, maybe ever. Obviously, you can't be sure that this is the solution. This is a trial on one person who has a lot of reason to really want this to be the case. But I think this is definitely good evidence to say that we should be looking into GHRH and other similar products to see if that really is a way of turning back the biological clock.
If we take this conversation back to first principles, what is the biological clock? What is the sense of sort of ageing, and why is it an issue? Why should we be wanting to experiment in this field?
So, the question of what the biological clock is a massive area of debate amongst biologists and people who are working in the ageing field. There are lots of things that correlate with ageing. So as you get older, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure gets worse, you find it harder to heal from like simple wounds, your lipid profile is worse, your cholesterol goes up. There are all kinds of things. So people can measure lots of these different factors, and then when you put them together, it looks like you're genetically or biologically older or genetically and biologically younger. So Brian Hanley's experiments have boosted his testosterone, his vision's gotten better, his arthritis is cured, all kinds of normal things that you would associate with being older are now not the case for him.
So when people talk about the idea that we might want to live for longer as a species, a lot of people think, oh, I don't want to live longer, I'll be frail, I'll be ill. It doesn't sound like, I mean, if you have a low quality of life, that's not something that's particularly attractive. But if we're able to have someone living, for example, in a state like them being in their 20s or 30s for longer, that could be a huge societal development.
That's ideal, and I would say it's probably more important than pushing our lifespans further as well. I think a lot of people end up with illnesses like diabetes and cholesterol problems that mean that they have a very long and protracted sort of elderly period from the age of like 70 to 80. But lots of people who are very long-lived end up very, very healthy until they're like late 90s, and then suddenly something gets them. I think that's a much preferable state to be. Obviously, it'd be wonderful if actually you end up with a very healthy period that goes on until you're 200 or so. But being very healthy until you're 90 and then suddenly being taken out is much more preferable to how most people are dying.
So potentially this research is as much about making the lifespans that we have much more healthy, much more productive, much more better lived than actually doubling the length that we live.
Precisely. So Brian, at the end of his main paper, says it is highly likely that all he has done is increase his health span, not his lifespan, but he's still very, very happy with that outcome.
So that's so incredible. Do we know if there are any larger scale research projects to do with this? Is there any state funding going into this? What's going on in the wider field of ageing and research?
There is not, and this is where it's quite frustrating. It's very difficult to get approval for the clinical trials that are going to target ageing specifically, because hardly any medical regulators recognise ageing itself as a disease worth curing. So you can do an Alzheimer's trial, or you can do an arthritis trial, or all kinds of stuff like that. But Japan is really the only country that has acknowledged that ageing is a disease that ought to have clinical trials in order to try.
That's quite politically contentious to suggest that ageing is a disease, because lots of people will feel they are ageing gracefully, that it's something that everyone goes through, that it's not necessarily something that's wrong with people. Might there be a better way to describe it to unlock funding?
True, yeah. Ageing as a disease is a way of framing it in terms of how medical regulators think. Obviously, we're quite used to receiving healthcare for normal parts of being a human. Like every pregnant woman is not saying pregnancy is a disease, but she's also going to her doctor for treatment and consultation on that. Aging as a disease is a way of putting it within medical regulators' frameworks of looking at clinical trials and that kind of thing. We don't need to intellectually or conversationally frame it as that.
So in our final 30 seconds, what needs to be done now? Who do we need to lobby? Who do we need to speak to? And when can I get this injection to make me stay in my 20s forever?
I think a really simple change that we could have is we could have NICE, which is the UK's main medicines purchaser for the NHS, say that they, using their already existing quality of life adjusted metrics, would purchase anti-aging drugs or therapies on a particular cost basis if they wanted that. But there's also loads we can do in terms of just injecting funding into 50 or 60 different projects that look like they could be promising. And that's a role for Innovate UK or the New Research Agency or, UK DARPA and that sort of thing.
Yeah, these sort of throw money at various different things and hope that one might work out. Well, Arya Babu, it's been so good to talk to you on this subject. It's something really important, and I'm glad we found time for it in the programme. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for the briefing this morning.